Right, so section four, what was the impact of the Second War on the German people? Well, if we look at the beginning of the war, there's some similarities what we know that occurred in Britain. So we get blackout regulations in the first morning of the conflict. Um, Often children are sent to live with their relatives. Children in the cities given gas masks, just like had been in Britain. But then we get these great successes happening with the German troops taking Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, and Britain's airfields even being targeted. December 1939, Hitler announced a war economy, something they've been planning for some time. Military expenditure rose dramatically. It was already pretty high. So 23% of goods produced were related to the military. By 1939, it had gone up to almost 47%, with 55% of the general workforce now employed in war work. So you can see there's a significant change there. However, the war economy really struggles, and this is largely because there are different military groups: the SS, the Wehrmacht, that's the army, the Luftwaffe, the air force, the navy, and local Nazi leaders all trying to get their way. And with as a result, the economy actually is greatly inefficient and lacks centralized control. The war economy really didn't exist by 1941, as each of these tried to fight against each other. So this changes with Albert Speer taking control. Albert Speer, Hitler had great faith in. He takes control of armaments and war production by February 1942. Hitler said to Speer, Speer, I'll sign anything that comes from you. So Speer did a combination of different things really. He tried to get the economy to look after itself, so industrial self-responsibility. Factories were given responsibility, but they had control maintained from a central planning board. Industrialists were encouraged to join, and he excluded the military personnel who had argued beforehand. Speer made sure that factories focused on a single product rather than a variety. He employed more women. He used concentration camp prisoners as workers, and he excluded skilled workers from compulsory military service, so that he made sure that the products were high quality. The result was significant. So tanks, we can see there, go up from 1940, got 1,600. And by 1944, there was 19,000, so an increase of three times under Speer in 2 years. Aircraft from 10,000 in 1940 to 40,000 in 1944, again, three times under Speer in 2 years. Civilians suffered, again, just like they had in Britain. January 1940, we had a terrible winter, worse so than in Britain. Temperatures rarely above 5 degrees Celsius, ice and snow meant it was impossible to travel. There was a lack of coal. Businesses, schools, beer halls, cafes were closed. People foraged for firewood in parks. They wore outdoor clothing inside. Anything they do can keep themselves warm. Rationing was introduced from the start. A really complicated system. People allocated points. No one really understood what it was. It was reissued each month according to supplies, and no one really knew where they stood. Jews had ration cards marked with a J. They had a much lower allocation. Very limited hours to shop, often just before closing when most of the goods had gone. And queuing and complaining became common. But if you did complain, you were likely to be punished. Women, Speer wanted women to work, but Hitler actually refused this. So women were never actually conscripted into work, as they were doing it in Britain. From 1939, women under 25 had to complete 6 months in the RAD, just like men had to have before that. Most of them worked in agricultural jobs. The restrictions on marriage loans were lifted so that women entered the workforce. We had almost three quarters of a million women were in war industries. By 1939, it had risen to almost double that by 1941, but 30 million was the total population, so most were preferring to stay at home. So again, the Nazis paying the price for their previous policies. By spring 1940, the RAF were bombing industrial areas and Berlin itself. A massive program of air shelters was begun, just like there had been in Britain. We see the KLV program, which saw voluntary evacuations of the countryside. If you were below 14, you could go for 6 months. If you were under 10, you could accompany by your mother. Conditions varied enormously. Fear of Nazi indoctrination, however, led to only 40,000 of the 260,000 eligible children in Berlin participating. So people were worried that if they sent their children away, they'd come back and knock themselves. So they didn't let them go. They'd rather take the risk of staying there. So that tells you something about the effectiveness of Nazification. Now, opposition clearly rises to the Nazis during the war years. So we get to the most famous example is the von Stauffenberg bomb threats, Operation Valkyrie, emergency order to allow the plotters to use the reserve army to remove the SS and the Gestapo. The bomb did go off, but a heavy table leg and the fact that they'd gone from a concrete bunker to a more open space due to the summer heat meant that Hitler survived. The conspirators were arrested and executed. Public criticism, no, so active opposition here, although not going as far as to be active rebellion. Galen, I mentioned this earlier, he made 3 famous sermons in 1941 denouncing the terror of the Gestapo, the taking of church property, and the execution, the euthanasia of mentally and physically disabled people. They distribute sermons, they distributed them around. The Catholic priests who were caught doing it were murdered, and Galen, who was too powerful, as we said, was placed under house arrest for the rest of the war. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Protestant pastor, preached against the Nazis. He joined the German resistance, joined Abwehr, sent messages to the resistance. He helped organise the escape of Jews to Switzerland and was arrested in 1943. Continued to preach to inmates and was killed in Flossenburg concentration camp in April 1945. One-off case, and it's the only example of Jews being saved by a public protest, the Rosenstrasse. 27th of February 1943, part Jewish men, so Mischlings, were taken and held at Rosenstrasse. Their Aryan wives maintained the protests, and although deportations did continue, they did secure the release of some political prisoners. The White Rose Group, a youth organisation, remember we talked about the idealism of the youth earlier. Sophia Hans Scholl were the leaders. They were influenced by Galen and what they heard about the treatment of Jews during the compulsory service on the Eastern Front. Their 5th leaflet in January 1943 appealed to all Germans, saying Hitler can't win the war. Up to 9,000 leaflets were distributed in 9 large cities around Germany. Their final leaflet, after the Nazi failure at Stalingrad, sought active resistance at a time of low morale. It was reported to the Gestapo at university by the caretaker there, and they faced their People's Court and execution. Otto and Elise Hampel wrote over 200 postcards asking people to resist military service and to stop donating money to overthrow Hitler. Nearly all of the 200 postcards that they distributed were handed to the Gestapo, showing how far people were scared of the Nazi regime. They were tried by the People's Court and executed in 1943. Active resistance, ultimately failure because of the fear of the German people. There was passive resistance. One woman repeatedly wrote 1918, talking about the fact that Germany had been defeated in World War I and would be again, on notices and posters, but it was covered in thick black paint each time. Soldiers returned from the east, talking about the Nazi barbaric treatment of the Jews and the Poles, and people started to turn against the Nazis, and the Nazis took a tougher line. We don't really know how much the people knew. We know that they feared persecution. We know that propaganda sold the myth of Hitler being the saviour. Bunker building welfare schemes focused the people's minds. Some may have been persuaded to continue to support the Nazis, but we'll never know how far people in their minds were opposed to the Nazis. Grumbling increased, but it's hard to measure precisely how much. So the Nazis from 1943 are clearly beginning to lose this war. They lost to the Russians at the Battle of Stalingrad. They were pushed out of North Africa by Britain and France. So we get the total war speech. Goebbels' speech talked about a total war, a shortest war, demanding people be willing to work 14-hour days, and a real radical total change, asking people to do everything they possibly could to win the war. It was played on radio, it was shown in cinemas, posters were distributed supporting the idea of total war. Finally, perhaps too late, 3 million 17 to 45-year-old women were finally called upon, although of those only 1 million responded. All non-war related issues were eliminated. Magazines closed, professional sport was ended, clothes rationing ended and replaced by exchange centres. So everything was focused on winning this war. Air raids took their toll on Germany. 40,000 died in a bombing firestorm in Hamburg in 1943. There were attacks on Berlin, causing almost 4,000 deaths. 0.5 million were left homeless, 100,000 were injured, but with much of Berlin destroyed. It continued into 1944. We had the D-Day invasions. Paris was liberated in 1944. Soviets entered Romania and Poland, so they're starting to come in from the east. Many fled to the countryside, whilst the Allies advanced with many refugees, which increased again the pressure of fuel and food. And the Nazi regime responded by increasing the amount of arrests and summary executions in 1944. And then after the bomb plot, the Stauffenberg bomb plot, 7,000 were arrested. The Hitler salute became compulsory for the first time. It was absolutely obligatory. Many had volunteered to do it, many chose to do it, but now it was compulsory as the Nazis began to panic. Goebbels was made the Reich trustee for total war. 0.5 million workers became soldiers and were replaced by untrained workers, decreasing production, so it had a knock-on effect. Women were allowed to do compulsory service up to the age of 50, and they used foreign workers. But in places like France and Netherlands, they used foreign workers who now made up an amazing quarter of the workforce, 7.6 million. Again, to save the resources, railway and postal services were cancelled. They shut down theatres and opera houses and music halls. Propaganda was further strengthened. People were warned about what they said in public. Everything was geared to this final push. In 1944, October 1944, near the end of the war, the Volkssturm, the People's Storm, was created, which included all males, including injured soldiers, from the age of 16 to 60 who were not in military service. They got only 4 days training. They had no uniform. They had only an armband. They were given old rifles and captured foreign weapons. So they're very poorly prepared. By 1945, February 1945, 25,000 killed in the Dresden firebombing, destruction of the medieval city there. Berlin was defended by 80,000 Volkssturm and Hitler Youth against an overwhelming odds of 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. Hitler took his own life on the 30th of April 1945, and Germany fell apart. The shops were already out of food. There were massive food shortages that led to starvation. Germany surrendered. Thousands took their own lives. Thousands were raped by Soviet soldiers advancing from the east, with hospital records revealing official figures, and this is only official, many of them wouldn't be reported, of 90,000 to 130,000 rapes in the weeks after the surrender. Kershaw has argued that a combination of terror, positive propaganda, and a belief in this man who had seen as a saviour of Germany had held the regime together until the bitter end, and once he had gone, it really fell apart.